Welcome to Impact Discipleship.
Wow. That was so professional. So professional.
I just can't even sit.
Okay. So here we are again, another Saturday. It's hot in South Florida, but it's not raining, and that's good. And so you'll be sweating out the scriptures today. That sounds like an aerobics class, sweating with scriptures. So turn your Bibles to Ephesians chapter 6. We're continuing our journey through the book of Ephesians. This is week 12. If you feel like, oh boy, I missed it all, just go right on the YouTube channel, kingdomembassyministries.org, and you can find all of the teachings from Friday nights and all of the discipleship teachings on Saturday. Generally, the teachings on Saturday are much longer because we spend quite a bit of time going through the Word. Today, we're just going to cover a handful of verses. Next week, we will finish the book of Ephesians, and the following week, we'll be doing the book of I don't know yet. We're waiting to see what God says. I have not Romans. Romans will take us 2 years to go through. We can do it, but if you want the book of Romans, if you really love it, I wrote a 100-page commentary on the book of Romans. I'll be very happy to email it to you if you want your brain twisted. You can have it. And but that I can send. Exodus. Wow, this is intense. If you want Exodus, you got to come Friday nights because we go Genesis, Exodus, Leviticus, Numbers, Deuteronomy, and Mark. Okay, I'm going to wait for God to tell me. Thank you for your suggestions. It's coming soon. Okay, we're going to start. We're going to start by just reading these verses, and then I'm going to point out the pieces. I would recommend you show up with a notebook, not just the Bible, and take notes. And at least mark the areas that are, you have a note.
Does anybody? This person, but I have a notebook, but I forgot a pen.
I have pens, and I'll put out paper. So, raise your hand if you want a pen and paper.
You know what? You know it's on. Let's camera. All right, we're gonna start though, and we're gonna start on this end over to my left, and go around. Yes, we are because she has the mic. And I want you to focus on the words because there's so many pieces inside of these handful of verses that are so extraordinary. So, Kimberly, if you would read Ephesians chapter 6, verses 5 through 9.
Bondservants, obey your earthly masters with fear and trembling, with a sincere heart as you would Christ, not by the way of eye service as people pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, doing the will of God from the heart, rendering service with a good will as to the Lord and not to man, knowing that whatever good anyone does, this he will receive back from the Lord, whether he is a bondservant or is free. Masters, do the same to them and stop your threatening, knowing that he is both their master and yours is in heaven, and that there is no partiality with him.
Excellent. I'm going to take a moment and point out the pieces inside of those 5 verses. But first, I would like you all, kind of in a moment of sobriety, like really reflection, I would like you to close your eyes, and I would like you to quietly contemplate the magnitude of what I'm about to read, okay? I'm going to read 1 Peter 2, 13 to 25. You don't have to turn there. I just want you to close your eyes and listen to these words of the Apostle Peter. Today's message is called The Bondservant and His Master. And before you leave today, you're going to get a healthy understanding of what it means when you see the phrase bondservant in the scriptures. But I want you to close your eyes and listen to these words of Peter from 1 Peter 2. Therefore, submit yourself in every ordinance of man for the Lord's sake, whether to the king as supreme or to governors, as to those who are sent by him for punishment of evildoers and for the praise of those who do good. For this is the will of God, that by doing good you may put to silence the ignorance of foolish men. As free, yet not using liberty as a cloak or vice, but as bondservants of God. Let me say that again. Not using liberty as a cloak or a vice, but as bondservants of God. honor all people, love the brotherhood, fear God, honor the king. Servants, be submissive to your masters with all fear, not only to be good and gentle, but also not only to the good and gentle, but to the harsh. For this is commendable, if because of conscience towards God one endures grief, suffering wrongfully. For what credit is it if, when you are beaten for your faults, you take it patiently? But when you do good and suffer, if you take it patiently, this is commendable before God. For to this you were called, because Christ also suffered for us, leaving us an example, that you should follow his steps, who committed no sin, nor was deceit found in his mouth, who when he was reviled did not revile in return. When he suffered, he did not threaten, but committed himself to him who judges righteously. But committed himself to him who judges righteously, who himself bore our sins in his own body on the tree, that we, having died to sins, might live to righteousness. But by whose stripes you are healed. For you are like sheep going astray, but have now returned to the shepherd and overseer of your souls. Father in heaven, we come before you. We submit this time to you, this teaching to you, understanding what it means to live as a bondservant, understanding what it means for Christ to have been the ultimate bondservant, and that we would all leave this time together changed forever. In the mighty name of Yeshua, Jesus. Amen.
What did you say the title was? Bondservant of Christ.
Bondservant and His Master. Okay, I want to introduce you to the concepts that you saw in those 5 verses in Ephesians. We're going to cover understanding bondservants and service with sincerity. We're going to take a look what it looks like in the natural when it's done right. What does it mean to be a bondservant in the natural, in the world, and get a picture of the deeper prophetic picture of what God is talking about as bondservants of Christ. How he did it, we should do it. It says, doing the will of God from the heart. That's a phrase you have to capture from Ephesians 6. Doing the will of God from the heart. And I'm going to connect you in advance to the moment in the Garden of Gethsemane when Yeshua was crying out to the Father, saying, I don't want to do this. Is there any other way? Knowing what was coming. And I submit to you, unless you've heard a teaching like this before, like some of my boys and some people here before, the ultimate sacrifice in the garden was not that he was just going to a tree and getting crucified. But he said that phrase, not my will, but your will be done. I want you to notice that when we get there. It also says this phrase, do as unto the Lord, not to men. There's 2 places that really speak, well, there's a place, I'll just read one. In Colossians 3, 22 and 23, it says, bondservants, obey in all things your masters according to the flesh. Meaning, in this body that you're living in, be obedient as bondservants. Not with eye service, very similar as men pleasers, but sincerity of heart, fearing God. And whatever you do, do heartily unto the Lord. Whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same back, is what he says. And we know in Galatians it says, do not be deceived. God is not mocked. Whatever a man sows, he reaps. For he who sows in the flesh will reap in the flesh corruption. But he who sows in the Spirit will reap in the Spirit everlasting life. And then it says, I know, let me just finish this one thing. It continues in Galatians 6, 9, and 10. And let us, here's for all of you. How many times in your life, I'm doing the right thing, it's not working out. I'm doing the right thing, it's not working out. Why do I still have struggles? I'm doing the right thing. Listen to what Paul says. And let us not grow weary while doing good. For in due season we shall reap if we do not lose heart. Therefore, as we have opportunity, let us do good to all, especially to those of the household of God.
That's such a picture right there of that plant. Like some people I noticed when we packed out, they just left their plant. They abandoned the plant. And nothing happened, no sprouts. I don't need it. And look how long it took for that little sprout to get going. Like, you can't give up. You know, you're the little seed. and you're going to sprout. And there's a different incubation period for every little seed. But this part that Jeff read, I mean, you know, you guys are taking in a lot as he's speaking. But listen to this. Whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord. What does that mean? Like, I want you to chew on that and give us the. Whatever someone does that's good, he will receive the same from the Lord. What does that mean?
Are you actually asking them to answer it?
I want some feedback.
They can't answer you without the mic.
Okay, raise your hand if you have something for that.
Question again?
Who has something for that?
No,
Of
the Lord
course
will
Nick
bless
does.
you.
The question
to-
is, okay.
Tell me what she said.
Whatever good anyone does, he will receive the same from the Lord.
What the Lord is saying there, what the apostle is saying there is that if you bless others, God will bless you. The Lord will bless you. The Bible says that whoever lends to the poor is actually lending to the Lord, and he will repay them for every good deed that he's done.
Yeah.
So
There's actually a term that, Ashley's got something. There's actually a term in the world that people use based on this. Do unto others as you want done to you. What do they call that? The golden rule. The golden rule.
I just think it's karma.
Some people call it that. What you put out, you get back.
But karma is not a Christian term, but
Right.
the concept is you're going to get what you pay for. Only the karma, they think you can get that in future lives.
Right.
All right, let's bring the mic back this way.
Just a moment.
Okay, let me finish this introduction. Okay? I want you to notice there's a phrase here about emulating Christ. Like, be a bondservant as Christ was a bondservant. But I want you to think of the actions of Christ as in connection with what the Father actually did. Most famous verse in the Bible is probably what? Now catch it from what the sacrifice that was made. For God so loved the world that he gave his only begotten Son. I don't think you can't have a bigger sacrifice than that. Meaning something's happening in this idea of bondservant that's enormous. The sacrifice is enormous, and you're going to see what Christ did. Of course, it says this in Philippians 2, and this is probably, if you are taking notes, this is probably the scripture you can kind of chew on to gather the quintessential understanding of the sacrifice Christ made. You might think, I've learned my whole Christian life. The sacrifice is he went to the cross. The sacrifice is he died for my sins. The sacrifice is he suffered. Philippians 2 tells us what the bigger sacrifice was. Let this mind be in you that was also in Christ Jesus, who being in the form of a God did not consider it robbery to be equal to God, but made himself of no reputation, taking on the form of a bondservant and coming into the likeness of men. And being found in appearance as a man, he humbled himself and became obedient to the point of death, even death on a cross. See, the death on the cross is the second sacrifice. The becoming a man was the greatest sacrifice. Now, you may not know why yet, but you're going to see before you end today why that is. Why that transition from the divine form to man was the greatest sacrifice Yeshua, Jesus, could make. Okay? I'm going to read one more thing before we start going around. And this is another thing that I want you to catch the scene. It's very important to catch the scene of the quality of human that Jesus was. The scene I want you to picture is the scene at the table of the Last Supper. Probably a long table, very likely he's sitting at the end of the table, not in the middle of the table, looking down at the men that were closest to him in his earthly life. And it says a few things, but I'm going to read something. Now, this verse does not specifically speak to the table. But my experience of this verse many years ago, in a kind of a vision with God, I saw this being what he was saying at the table. Even though this comes from the book of Hebrews, and even though there's lots of argument about who even wrote the book of Hebrews, and whether or not the author of that book was even sitting at that table. Maybe he was, maybe he wasn't. But if you again can close your eyes and imagine looking through the eyes of Christ at that moment. Picture it. He's sitting at the table. He's just less than a half a day or about a half a day away from this incredible suffering. He knows it's coming. And picture he says this. Hebrews 12, 1 to 3. Therefore, since we are surrounded by such a great cloud of witnesses, let us throw off everything that hinders and the sin that so easily entangles us. And let us run with perseverance the race marked out before us, fixing our eyes on Jesus, the pioneer and perfecter of our faith. Here's the picture. For the joy that was set before him, endured the cross. There he is looking down the table. For the joy that was set before him, he endured the cross, scorning its shame, and sat down at the right hand of the throne of God. Consider him who endured such opposition from sinners, so that you will not grow weary and lose heart. That account, which you should do when you leave here today, and I would recommend you even take on the habit of reading John 13, 14, 15, 16, and 17. Pick a season of your life and read it over and over and over and over again. Just like in the same season, every day for the next 30 days. You will have such an experience of the greatest promises of God that you will see anywhere in the Bible. What's the scene? First of all, it's the longest sermon in the Bible. It's the longest dissertation that Jesus gave. It's the moment he's sitting at the table at what we call the Last Supper. And it begins with this phrase. I'm only going to read 6 verses out of chapter 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. 5 straight chapters is the account of the Last Supper. It only appears in the book of John. The other Gospels, the Synoptic Gospels, have little pieces of it. But this is a one-through sermon. It starts with this. Connect this to what I'm telling you it says in Hebrews chapter 12. Fix your eyes on Jesus. For the joy set before him, he endured the cross. I want you to consider yourself the joy that was set before him. The joy that was set before him is you. The men at that moment sitting at the table represent you. And this is what it says in the first 6 verses of John 13. And the supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas, I'm sorry, I skipped a few verses. Now before the feast of the Passover, when Jesus knew his hour had come, that he should depart from this world to the Father, having loved his own who are in the world, he loved them to the end. This is the moment. You know when he said it to his mother, my hour has not yet come? This is the moment where he knew his hour had come. That meant he knew the end is near. This is the moment. My death is coming. And the supper being ended, the devil having already put into the heart of Judas Iscariot, Simon's son, to betray him, Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, and that he had come to God and was going to God, rose up from the table, laid aside his garments, took a towel, girded himself, and after that he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet. This is a man who's about to suffer the most horrible death possible. And what he's doing in that moment, he picks up a towel and he washes the feet of the men that he loved the most. He said, for the joy set before him endured the cross. And to wipe them with the towel which was girded, and then came Simon Peter, and Peter said to him, Lord, why are you washing my feet? The rest goes. You should read the narrative. It's and the promises, all power, all truth, greater things coming, all love, all prophetically declared over God's people. And in that moment, he says, all the way at the end, when he's praying over them, he says, by the way, everything I'm telling you here is not just for you sitting here alone, but everybody who would believe because of you. That's what he says in John 17:20. He's identifying what I'm about to do, what I'm doing, washing your feet, the suffering I'm going to endure, the joy set before me. It's for everyone who will come to faith in Christ because of what you men are going to do when you walk out this door. And by the way, what I'm going to do in the next 13 hours of my life. Okay? What you're going to realize, the exchange that takes place between him and the Father in the Garden of Gethsemane says it all. And it's the call on every one of your lives because you were the joy set before him.
It's the
Okay.
epitome of do hard things and hard is the new fun.
If you could turn, Savannah, to Luke's Gospel, Matthew, Mark, Luke. So, Luke 22, Matthew, Mark, Luke. I just want to read this before we turn to the actual concept of bondservant. I want you to leave here declaring. I might even ask you to stand and say, I take it on. I want to take the role of bondservant. When you see what happened, I want to read one little excerpt out of Luke's Gospel, Luke the physician, who has a spin on what took place at the table. Okay? If you would read Luke 22, 24 to 30, I might stop you and point out some pieces. This is the same event. The same event of John 13, 14, 15, 16, 17. This is Luke's spin of what Jesus was saying.
22 to what?
24 to 30.
Also, a dispute arose among them, to which of them was considered to be the greatest. Jesus said to them, "The kings of the Gentiles lord it over them, and those who exercise authority over them call themselves benefactors. But you are not going to be like that. Instead, the greatest among you should be the youngest, and the one who rules like the one who serves."
You catch that? The one who rules is going to be like the one who serves. Okay? Go ahead.
For who is greater, the one who is at the table or the one who serves? It is not the one who is at the table.
Is it
Is
not?
it?
Is it not?
the one who is at the table? But I am among you as one who serves. You are those who have stood by me in my trials.
Power off.
Go ahead. Continue.
And I confer on you a kingdom.
Listen to that again. Say it nice and loud.
I confer on you a kingdom.
I confer or bestow on you a kingdom. By the way, this is the same men he's talking to at the table. And not just to them, but to you. Go ahead.
Just as my father conferred one on me, so that you may eat and drink at my table in my kingdom and sit on thrones, judging the 12 tribes of Israel.
Wow. Can you imagine? Listen, what he's giving you is the ability to judge the nations, to judge in his kingdom. He's looking all the way at the end game of what he was about to do. What he was about to do in the next 13 hours of his life was going to set something in motion that would radically change history. For you. Not just for them. By the way, he said, not just for you, but everyone who would believe because of you in that moment. Okay. We're going to turn our Bibles to Exodus chapter 21. Jill? You're going to see something in Exodus 21, which is a magnificent picture of Christ himself. And we're going to go to the first 6 verses of Exodus 21. Those that are just listening, I want you to imagine he's talking about Jesus. He really seems to be talking about some household servant. This area of Scripture is called the law of the Hebrew servant. But I want you to picture Christ in this picture, okay? And then I'll point out all the pieces that are important. So read those first 6 verses, Jill.
Now these are the judgments which you shall set before them. If you buy a Hebrew servant, he shall serve 6 years, and in the 7th he shall go out free and pay nothing. If he comes in by himself, he shall go out by himself. If he comes in married, then his wife shall go out with him. If his master has given him a wife, and she has borne his sons or daughters, the wife and her children shall be her master's, but he shall go out by himself. But if the servant plainly says, I love my master, my wife, and my children, I will not go out free. Then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce his ear as an owl, and
An
he
awl.
shall serve him further.
Oh, yeah. They serve him further. Okay, let me point out the picture. A Hebrew servant is in bondage for 6 years. He's then permitted to go free without cost in the 7th year, meaning you can go, you're independent, be on your own. But there's some important stipulations. If he comes in by himself, he's allowed to leave by himself. He came in alone, you could leave alone. If he comes in married, then his wife can go with him. If he comes in alone and the master gives him a wife, this is a key. If he comes in alone and the master gives him a wife, and she's borne him children, the wife and the children belong to the master. If he wants to leave, he has to leave them behind. Got it? If you came in alone, the master gave you a wife, all the fruit of that marriage belongs to the master. You could still go, but you can't keep them. But if the servant says, I love my master. Remember, bondservant and slavery from a Hebrew standpoint is not like we saw in the ugly history of England and U.S. It's not that slavery. It's like a household family member. If the servant loves his master and wife and children, he can choose to stay. Now here's the choose to stay thing that's really important. He gets one shot at this. He can either go or stay, one chance. If he goes, he leaves without his family. If he stays, he's stuck forever. You can't change your mind later. As proof, the master takes him to the city gate and pierces his ear. Like this. Probably gives him an earring. Says you're mine forever. Pierced, you're mine forever. That's the picture. I don't know about you, but that's a pretty amazing picture of Christ. But let me show you the ramifications of what is taking place here. So I want you to think of Messiah as the bondservant, right? Jesus went from freedom to slavery. He was free. He was the one part of the Trinity. His form was spirit. And he contracted. Remember we read in Philippians? He humbled himself, shed the spirit person, it came in human form. The question you have to ask yourself is, will he ever return to the form he shed? And the answer is, if he chooses to, well, if he chose to, he could have. He had an option. But the consequence of the choice he made, no matter what that choice is, would be permanent. It would be a permanent choice. One shot at it, permanent choice, right? And here it says in John 1:14, and the Word became flesh and dwelt among us, and we beheld his glory, the glory of the only begotten Son. It says, what we just read in Ephesians, let this mind of Christ be in you. What mind was in Christ? Bondservant. Choice. Do I go or do I stay forever? Right? It says in Philippians 2, 5-11, let this mind be in you, which was also in Christ, who being a form of God, God is spirit, did not consider it robbery to be equal with God, but taking on the likeness of man in a body, he became flesh. That's the point you have to get, right? It says, but the hour is coming, and now it is when true worshipers will worship the Father in spirit and in truth, and the Father is seeking such to worship him. God is blank, and those who worship him in blank. God is what? Spirit. God is spirit. So now we have this vast contrast. We have pre-incarnate Jesus is spirit. He becomes, he's not going to do that again. He becomes flesh. And there's a moment in his life where he has the option to go back to spirit or never go back to spirit. Who's up to read? Libby. Luke's Gospel 22, 41 to 42. This shows up in a lot of places in the Gospel. We'll just read it here. Luke's Gospel 22, 41 to 42.
You guys want to move out of the sun? Just move your chairs like 2 feet.
Yeah, you said chapter 22.
Chapter 22, 41 to 42.
That whole row could just move in.
I'll read it.
No, you go right here. No, I've got, this is hot, by the way. Go ahead. Shh. Focus here, guys.
And he was withdrawn from them about a stone's throw, and he knelt down and prayed, saying, Father, if it is your will, take this cup away from me. Nevertheless, not my will, but yours be done.
So we all recognize this is the moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. It shows up in all the Gospels where Christ is sweating blood. He knows what's going to come. This is the tail end of that period of time. Well, this is right after the dinner. When he goes out to, this is right after the dinner where he says, here's all this amazing things. Right after the dinner, all this stuff, all these promises, all these miracles, wash the feet. He knows his hour has come. He goes to pray in the garden. Judas goes off, betrays him. They come to arrest him. In the between that, he's praying, and he's like, I don't want to do this. Now, there's no doubt, as a man, the suffering that was coming was going to be brutal, and he didn't want to do that. But what was happening in the moment that we see in Ephesians 6, not with eye service, as men pleasers, but as bondservants of Christ, this is what he's saying you have to be, doing the will of God from the heart. Imitating Christ was doing the will of God. In the garden, he made an ultimate decision. Not my will, your will be done. What was at stake? He came into the world as a slave. He had a moment in time when he could pack it in and leave. His moment of freedom was right there in the garden. I don't want to do this. I'm packing it in. He came alone, but he would have to leave alone. That means the bride he was given, which was who? You. He would have to leave behind. This was the choice. I love my master. I love my wife. If I leave now, I can't keep them. Now, what was at stake? Not just...
When you think about what we taught it identified the emotional stages of development, you guys remember that? What kind of a choice did he make? Where was he on that scale when he chose others? He chose us, right? He wasn't being an emotional teenager saying, don't tell me what to do, right? He was being what? An emotional adult, right? Win-win, thinking for us, not thinking about just himself. I want you to tie those things in. Because you have to constantly be checking in with yourself. Like, yeah, do I live life that way? Do I only think about what I want? Is self on the throne? Or am I capable? Do I choose into considering the others that it's going to affect in my world? For the good and the bad. Choosing in to a walk with God is making an impact in the earth. Which is what you all are. Pure potential to do that.
Turn your Bibles to Luke 24. Now, in this moment, we know the decision he made. He made the decision to stay. Not my will, your will be done. He went to the cross. He went through that whole suffering, horrible. First he was beaten, his skin was torn from his body, his hair was ripped out of his beard. Giant spikes of thorns were pushed into his skull. He was ridiculed, spat on. He had to carry a cross that even in our best health as men we couldn't probably carry. And then he expired. He died. And then he resurrected, and something happened. He resurrected differently. He wasn't human anymore. What was he? Okay, so read Luke 24. Are you there? Yes, 24, 36 to 43. This is after he resurrects. You got the mic? Okay, good.
Now as they said these things, Jesus himself stood in the midst of them and said to them, "Peace to you." But they were terrified and frightened and supposed they had seen a spirit. And he said to them, "Why are you troubled, and why do doubts arise in your hearts? Behold, my hands and my feet, that it is myself. Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have a flesh and bones, as you see I have."
Read that again. Nice and loud. That one verse. Handle me. He says, touch me. Read it again.
"Handle me and see, for a spirit does not have flesh and bones, as you see I have."
See, he came back. He's not a spirit. He's not a spirit. He came back. Not a spirit. Flesh and bones. Doesn't say flesh and blood. You're flesh and blood. We're flesh and blood. Before he died, he was flesh and blood. He comes back, flesh and bones. It's a different phrase. Continue.
When he had said this, he showed them his hands and his feet. But while they did not believe for joy and marveled, he said to them, "Have you any food here?" So they gave him a piece of broiled fish and some honeycomb, and he took it and ate it in their presence.
Okay. Now, I want turn to Acts chapter 1. Acts chapter 1.
You guys, even
Verses
if you're not
9 to
reading,
11.
Turn to it.
Matthew, no. In the middle of the book, Matthew, Mark, Luke, John. Acts, it's the middle of the Bible. Well, towards the end of the book. Yeah. New Testament. Chapter 1, 9 to 11.
You know,
Acts.
laying your eyes on the Bible, it actually has an anointing.
This is important.
Living book.
This is kind of like we're proving out a legal argument here about what happened with Christ. He came as a man. He humbled himself. He went from spirit to flesh and blood. He went through all that suffering. He made that decision in the garden. I want to stay. I love my master. I love my bride. I'm staying. He went through all the torture. He resurrected. They saw him. They said, "What are you?" They didn't even recognize him. He looked differently. He said, "It's me, but I'm still here. Touch me." He had a physical body, but it was different. He says, "It's not like God. God is spirit. I have flesh and bones." Now watch what happens in Acts chapter 1, 9 to 11.
Now when he had spoken these things, while they watched, he was taken up, and a cloud received him out of their sight. And while they looked steadfastly toward heaven as he went up, behold, 2 men stood by them, in white apparel, who also said, "Men of Galilee, why do you stand gazing up into heaven?"
Pause right there 1 moment before we read the last verse, the last piece. Remember, they watched him get taken right up into heaven in the form that he was, that flesh and bone that he walked around on the earth, and they said, "Wow, he looks different, but that's him." The way he went up, read the next verse.
This same Jesus who was taken up from you into heaven will so come in like manner as you saw him go into heaven.
He went up with this body that's got flesh and bones. He's coming back with that body that has flesh and bones. Never, ever, ever will he return to spirit. Mark that in your mind. It's the greatest sacrifice that could have ever been offered in the history of the universe. The cross, the suffering, the momentary torture that maybe even took hours, that's like a 1 on a scale of 1 to infinity compared to that sacrifice. Never again, ever, will he return to spirit. The greatest sacrifice he made was becoming a human and in the garden saying, "I'll stay. I can't go back. I'll stay." I'm telling you, when you're walking out your faith, when people say, "Oh, well, any man has ever died, men die for another." You know how many men in the earth have died for one another? I would die like Christ died for my wife without a second thought, and I'm not Jesus. Like, I wouldn't think twice about dying for the people I love. I wouldn't. Like, I would do it. Momentary suffering to save someone else, no problem. That's not the big thing that Jesus did. It's this. I can't do what he did because I was never spirit. I wasn't one of the piece of the Godhead, one of the Trinity, coming down and becoming man and never going back, right? Now, why was it necessary? Who's up next? 1 Corinthians 15, 42 to 49. 1 Corinthians 15, 42 to 49. Yep, go ahead and read it.
So also is the resurrection of the dead. The body is sown in corruption, it is raised in incorruption. It is sown in dishonor, it is raised in glory. It is sown in weakness, it is raised in power. It is sown in a natural body, it is raised a spiritual body.
Pause in a moment. You hear what he's saying? This flesh and blood body goes into the ground, and it's raised differently. It's a natural body, it's raised a spiritual body. What kind of body? The same kind of body we're talking about Christ had. Not a flesh and blood body, a flesh and bone body. By the way, very likely what we're seeing is that what you have as blood, Christ had as light, right? And that's why he's passing through walls and zipping all over the universe and going from one place to another. By the way, that's your inheritance coming. Who's excited about that? I mean, you can imagine what you could see. The whole universe is going to be like light speed, like this, right? Come on, yeah, exactly. Continue.
There is a natural body and there is a spiritual body. And so it is written. The first man, Adam, became a living being. The last Adam became a life-giving spirit. However, the spirit is not first but the natural, and afterward the spiritual. The first man was of the earth, made of dust. The second man is the Lord from heaven. As was the man of dust, so also are those who are made of dust, and as is the heavenly man, so also are those who are heavenly. And as we have borne the image of the man of dust, we shall also bear the image of heavenly man.
Okay, did you get it? You have the image of the man of dust, like the first Adam. Adam and Eve were flesh and blood. Jesus, when he came, flesh and blood. Jesus' new body, flesh and bones, a heavenly body. You also are getting the heavenly body. Well, that really makes good sense, because I don't think two different species should be getting married, right? A heavenly body has to marry a heavenly body. You can't marry Christ as a human. And Christ couldn't become a spirit and keep you as his bride, because what you're inheriting is a spiritual body. The whole thing was orchestrated so you can marry Christ. The entire thing was orchestrated so you could be the bride of Christ, right? It says in Romans 8, 16 and 17, the Spirit himself bears witness with our spirit that we are children of God, and if children, then heirs. Heirs of God and joint heirs with Christ. And indeed, we suffer with him, we be glorified together. Glorified together. Married as glorified beings together. Right? Okay, the bride. Let's move on to, let's see. Who's up? Ephesians. Let's go backwards in Ephesians. We studied this a few weeks ago. Watch that mic. It's hot. So, go to Ephesians 5, 25 to 32. I'll read one verse in 2 Corinthians. 25 to 32. One verse in 2 Corinthians 11:2. For I am jealous for you with a godly jealousy, for I have betrothed to you one husband, that I may present you as chaste virgin to Christ. What's taken place when Christ did his job, and what took place when you became a Christian, is you didn't become the bride of Christ, you became betrothed to to Christ. Betrothal is something that was common in biblical days, not so common today. Betrothal, today we use what we call the engagement, an engagement ring. I'm going to get married to that person, right? Betrothal is as binding as marriage. You know, take the ring, put the ring on, take the ring off. That doesn't happen. That's why Mary, the mother of Jesus, when Joseph found out that she was pregnant and thinking she had done something not right, secretly wanted to divorce her. But wait a minute, they weren't even married. They were only betrothed. Well, betrothal requires divorce. It's that binding. You are bound, betrothed to Christ, but you're not yet the bride of Christ because you can't marry him. You're not the same species. Not yet. At your death and resurrection, at his coming, you'll be the same species. Okay? Go ahead and let's just read the mystery. Now you'll never read this marriage verse again in the Bible and see it the same. Go ahead and read about marriage in Ephesians 5. 25, yes, to 32.
Husbands, love your wives, just as Christ also loved the church and gave himself for her, that he might sanctify and cleanse her with the washing of water by the word, that he might present her to himself a glorious church, not having spot or wrinkle or any such thing, but that she should be holy without blemish. So husbands ought to love their own wives as their own bodies. For he who loves his wife loves himself. For no one ever hated his own flesh, but nourishes and cherishes it, just as the Lord does the church. For we are members of his body, of his flesh, and of his bones. For this reason, a man shall leave his father and mother and be joined to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. This is a great mystery that I speak concerning Christ and the church. Nevertheless...
That's it, right there. You get what's happening here? Marriage originally was always and ever planned in the entire configuration of it as a picture of what ultimately Christ was going to do by letting you become his bride. The only way that could happen is you both needed to transform. He had to leave the spirit, become human, and become glorified. You go from human to glorified. Same species. That's what has to happen. Okay? Let me fast forward right to the end of where you see this before we move on. And it says in Revelation 19, 7 and 8, let us be glad. This is, by the way, this is all the way at the end of the story. This is when the marriage actually takes place. All the way up until this time, you're betrothed. Let us be glad and rejoice and give him glory, for the marriage of the Lamb has come, and his wife has made herself ready, and to her it was granted to be arrayed in fine linen, clean and bright, for the fine linen is the righteous acts of the saints. Revelation 21, when now he sees the bride, now I saw a new heaven and a new earth, for the first heaven and the first earth had passed away. Also there is no more sea. Then I, John, saw the holy city, the new Jerusalem, coming down out of heaven, prepared as a bride, adorned for her husband. We could talk about a lot of prophetic pictures there. But the bottom line is currently you're betrothed. Later you'll be getting married when you're the same species. So the ultimate sacrifice, don't ever forget this, was his moment in the garden when he said, not my will, but your will be done. And he knew that forever in that moment he would never go back to be spirit. The ultimate sacrifice. So the next step, and we'll finish up in this topic, I think, is what about you? You're living here on the earth. You're his future bride. You're his betrothed. You're his fiancée, so to speak. What about you? Okay, what was his advice? Who's up? Let's see, Cyrus, read Matthew 20, 26 to 28. Matthew 20, 26 to 28. Yes, 26 to 28. Listen, just kind of close your eyes when he's reading this and think about, this is what I'm called to do. This is what my whole life needs to be framed around as a Christian. Go ahead.
Yet it shall not be so among you, but whoever desires to become great among you, let him be your servant. And whoever desires to be first among you, let him be your slave. Just as the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many.
You see that slave there? Bondservant. Bondservant. Your job is to live as a bondservant. Just because of time and trying to not go too long, let me just point out so you could write down if you're taking notes how many times this appears in the New Testament. Well, some of the times. I'm not going to point them all out. But Paul says this first: imitate me just as I imitate Christ. That's 1 Corinthians 11:1. It says in 2 Peter 1:1, Peter, Simon Peter, a bondservant of the Apostle Jesus. In 1 Peter, he says, I'm living not as free or using the cloak of liberty as a vice. We read this already, but as a bondservant. Paul says in Philippians 1, Paul, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. James says in James 1, James, a bondservant of God. Jude says in Jude chapter 1, Jude, a bondservant of Jesus Christ. Every one of these writers was thinking of Exodus, was thinking about the sacrifice that Christ made in the garden, was thinking about the ultimate option he had: stay or go free. But if I leave, I can't keep my bride. Now I want you to go back in your minds to the table as we finish up. Go back to the table. Go back to the moment. He's looking down. He's looking down the table. He knows what's coming. He knows the final decision has to be made. Not just to go to the cross, not just to suffer and die, but to never go back. Can you imagine that scene again? And what he says, for the joy set before me. I don't know about you. I don't know about you. There's nothing more intense in my life than to think that God himself would sacrifice his very form for me as his joy. And when he said that, remember, not just for you 12 sitting here before me, but for everyone who would come after you that would believe because of you. In John chapter 13, he says, when he finished washing their feet, he put on his clothes and returned to his place. And he says this, do you understand what I've just done? He wasn't talking about just washing feet. Do you understand what I've just done? You call me teacher and Lord, and rightly so, for that is what I am. Now that I am your Lord and teacher, I've washed your feet. You also should wash one another's feet. For I have set an example for you of what should be done. He wasn't just talking about washing feet. You get it? He wasn't just talking. He was talking about pay attention to what's about to come. Keep your eye on what's about to take place. The greatest sacrifice that could ever be made is about to take place. That's my example. You also do that. It says in John 15:13, greater love has no man than this, than to lay down his life for a friend. Matthew 23:11 and 12, great. For those who exalt themselves will be humbled, but those who humble themselves will be exalted. Philippians 2:3, do nothing out of selfish ambition and vain conceit. In humility, value others over yourself. 1 Peter 4:8-10, above all, love each other deeply, because love covers a multitude of sins. Offer hospitality to one another without grumbling. Each of you should use whatever gift you have received to serve others as faithful stewards of God's grace. Here's how you do it. Here's how you become a bondservant. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve and give his life as a ransom for many. Luke 14, if any of you comes after me and does not hate his father and mother, wife, children, or brothers, yes, even his own life, such cannot be my disciple. Whoever does not carry their own cross and follow me cannot be my disciple. That's verses 26 to 27. Anyone who loves his life will lose it, while anyone who hates his life in this world will keep it for eternity. Whoever serves me must follow me, and where I am, my servant will also be. And my Father will honor those who serve me. John 12, 25 to 26. Galatians 2:20. I have been crucified with Christ. I've shared with his crucifixion. It is no longer I who live, but Christ who lives in me. That the life I now live in the body, I live by faith in the Son of God who loved me and gave himself for me. Nick, turn to Romans chapter 6, 3 to 7. Yes, we're almost done. Almost done. Six, 3 to 7. Listen to what you're supposed to identify with. You all are going to have your Garden of Gethsemane moment. Not my will, but your will be done. I want to do it. I want to take it on. I identify with it. Go ahead.
Romans 6, 3 through 7. Or do you not know that all of us who have been baptized into Christ Jesus have been baptized into his death? Therefore we have been buried with him through baptism into death, so that as Christ was raised from the dead through the glory of the Father, so we too might walk in the newness of life. For we have become united with him in the likeness of his death, certainly we shall also be in the likeness of his resurrection, knowing this, that our old self was crucified with him, in order that our body of sin might be done away with, so that we would no longer be slaves to sin. For he who has died is freed from sin.
Wow. So do you guys see the common denominator? Die to self like Christ died. A bondservant or a serving leader chooses others over himself and is willing to die for the other. Now, as we finish, I want us to go back and read. I'm going to read a little piece again when we're back in Exodus 21. But if the servant says, I love my master and wife and my children, I will not go free. Then his master shall bring him to the judges. He shall also bring him to the door or to the doorpost, and his master shall pierce him, his ear with an awl, and he shall serve him forever. Tell me that doesn't take on a whole new meaning for you. Husbands, love your wives just as Christ loved the church and gave himself for her, and make her holy, and cleansing her with the washing of the water of the word, and to present her to himself a radiant church without stain or wrinkle or blemish, but holy and blameless. That's what Christ did. That's what you're called to do. Why? For the joy set before him. Why you? For the joy set before you. That's the choice you get to make here and now. That's the choice you make when you become a Christian. Nothing greater than to emulate the life of Christ. So, Father, we come before you. We thank you. Father, I just pray that a deep impression of what a true bondservant is has penetrated your people today. Father, that you would individually touch them to know deeply the sacrifice you made in the garden, the ultimate sacrifice beyond the human suffering, behind the whipping and the scourging and the torn flesh and the crucifixion and the suffocation and the shame. Beyond it all was that moment in the garden when you said, Not my will, but your will be done. I pray, Father, that would impress your followers like never before, and that they would live a life worthy of that calling in the mighty, mighty name of Yeshua. Amen and amen. Thank you for joining us online. We'll see you next time. Bye. Say goodbye, people.
Bye.